you look at the Carrefour management, every one of them, just about every one of them, had an MBA degree. The winner in the retail business in China is called Pangdonglai. It's getting all of a sudden out of Henan province in the middle of nowhere. But the founder of that retailer did not even finish his high school. They all sound right academically, but then in reality, they are proven wrong. The China has the same problem. In America, the Chinese-American hand is the same. They're not so much in touch with reality as often as should. Yet you travel from Beijing to Shanghai by airplane. You go there and meet the local officials or the local academics, and then that's give you enough knowledge to write a paper. Again, you can make a good presentation to your audience, and that it sounds perfect right. But then it just kind of right only at the academic level.
Good evening, Jonathan. Thanks for joining me today.
Good morning to you, Will. How are you?
Doing well. How about yourself?
Very well, thank you.
Well, again, thank you so much for joining me. Of course, we're former colleagues and we've had many times to catch up, and we've even after our days with Walmart, we've continued to stay in touch, and I always enjoy our conversations. But I especially welcome this opportunity to ask you all the questions that I want to, and to also be able to share that with the audience. So again, thank you.
It's a great pleasure. It's always a pleasure talking to you and having all these discussions. I'll be as candid as I can and to have our conversation.
Great. Well, I'll start with a little bit of flattery, and this flattery serves a purpose because it gets me into my first set of questions. You are one that you, more than just about anybody I've met, has not just a cross fluency, not just bilingual in two languages, but like a cross-cultural fluency. I feel like you understand, not only is your English great, but you understand Western culture. You understand our idioms or the literature. I think a lot of the the social psychology of the West. And I think it's really amazing, and especially for somebody of your generation. Certainly after China opened, you saw a lot of kids go to college abroad, and they were able to pick up that cross-cultural fluency pretty well. But I feel like you are really unique, especially of your generation, of having this cross-cultural fluency between two just dynamically different cultures as China and the West, in many ways, at least. So I want to start with asking you, how did you get curious about Western cultures or foreign cultures? What gave you those opportunities, and how that led to you actually making a career out of working with multinationals?
Well, first of all, thank you for the comment. I guess I can say, yes, I am lucky. Let's use that word. I'm lucky in the sense that I belong to the generation which were just in time for China's open and reforms. That's at the end of 1978. And that's when I started to go to university. And then, I'm just innate for that. Because we're the first generation, and there are always opportunities waiting for me rather than I have to chase them. Unlike young people nowadays, they have to compete for opportunities. But in my generation, because we have a very small number of people at that time who went to university, et cetera, there were always lots of opportunities waiting for us. So that's why. But personally, just to go back to your question about culture, I started to learn English at a very young age. I remember at the end of primary school, the Chinese primary school is grade 6. By U.S. terms. By the end of that, I was supposed to go on to middle school for another 3 years. But instead of going to a regular middle school, I was sent, I don't know why they picked me, but I was sent to what they call the foreign languages school. There were only 5 such schools across China at that time. The one I went to was the Tianjin Foreign Languages School. It was a boarding school. Again, it was very rare to go to a boarding school at that time. So I was sent to that school and I spent 5 years there learning pretty much nothing but English. So that's how I started. And then after graduation, I became a teacher in a high school. I was actually 16 years old, and I started to teach. Some of my students were even older than I was. But anyway, that's how I started. And then we have the university entrance examination. The government decided to restart that system. Because of the Cultural Revolution, they stopped the entrance examination. University students for 10 years during the Cultural Revolution, they were chosen from what they call the workers, the peasants, and the soldiers. based on their political performance rather than academic performance. So in 1977, the country saw that's a disadvantage. They can support China's big ambition to open and reform. So they decided to reintroduce the entrance examination. So we became the first generation class 77. So I was a member of the class 77. It was a very rigorous 2.5 day examinations, and I passed it and ended up in, again, studying English. So that's how. So this is pretty much in a sense, by default, I studied English. But then once I studied English at the university, I thought, since I'm starting learning English, I should try to go overseas to see what it was like, because in the second year of my university, we started to have foreign experts. We had teachers, professors one from Australia, a few from the US, and they, again, brought in teaching materials, books, and everything. That roused my curiosity. I said, I have to go out. So from then on, it was pretty much by design that I want to go outside to immerse myself. I always like to use that word, to immerse myself in a foreign culture, to learn from real life rather than just in the classroom in China. So after university, stayed in the university where I was a student. I got a job over there for 2.5 years to teach. And then I went to Canada to pursue a graduate study in Canadian and American literature. I spent 2 years over there. At the end of the program, it was also really this by design. I was against the tide. Honestly, young people going abroad at that time, not many of them came back. I could understand them. There were more opportunity outside, and there were more attractions, of course, but all decided to stay outside, primarily in the US, in Canada, in the UK. But I thought, no, I want to go back. I think there will probably be more opportunities for me long-term in China. So I decided to come back. I was literally one of the very, very few to come back. I remember they had a new policy to incentivize people who want to come back to China by providing a free air ticket, a return ticket. That cost a lot of money at that time. And I said, okay, I want to take advantage of that policy. So I approached the Chinese embassy in Ottawa. They couldn't believe that I wanted to go back. Even they couldn't believe I wanted to go back. They asked me a lot of questions and finally decided, okay, let's take the risk. So they gave me a free ticket.
He genuinely wants to go back.
Yeah, so that's how I came back. I think that was the right decision. At first, there weren't many opportunities for that. I came back in 1986. I went out in 1984. 2 years later, 86, I came back. But then when I came back, I decided, again, it's curiosity. Rather than stay in teaching, I want to be a journalist. I thought journalists have a lot more opportunity to see a lot of things. So I became a journalist with Beijing Review. It's a Chinese news weekly in foreign languages. I stayed about 8 years over there. During that time, international companies start to come into China. Just about every day, we have only one English language newspaper, China Daily. You'll see recruitment ads. I was so tempted. I said, I want to give it a try. I want to give up my secure government job and go into private sector and see what it looks like. So I just pick an ad without knowing what it's really about, send in my resume, and they called me in for an interview. And it turned out to be a PR company. I had no idea what PR was at that time. The person who interviewed me was a French gentleman. He was the founder of arguably the first foreign-owned PR company in China. So he gave me the interview. The job I applied for was a translator. I thought I was only able to do translation for him. I couldn't do anything else. But after the interview, he said, you know what? I think you should do account servicing. Why do you want to do into translation? I said, I have no other skills. I don't know what account servicing is. I thought account servicing means accounting. I said, I have no
I'm
knowledge
not good with
in
numbers.
finance. He laughed. I shared that joke with him not long ago when he came back to China. We laughed. He just laughed. He said, no, there's nothing to do with finance. This is account servicing. You support our clients. I said, okay, you're the boss. If you say I can do it, I'll try to do it. If not, I can always come back to do translation. So that's how I started. Again, this is pretty much the first generation of PR professionals in this country. Really starting from very basics. Lots of arms and legs work at that time. many multinational companies just came in, and their assignment at that time was very straightforward, pretty much name recognition, just telling the story about the company, very basic assignments. So, but that turned out to be a good learning opportunity for me. You start from very basic things. And so that's how I started in this profession, corporate affairs. Looking back, I've come through a number of major multinational corporations, starting with a PR firm, of course, for 3 years, and then moving on to Airbus,
Mm.
and then to Siemens, and then to Boeing, Walmart, Nestlé, and then back to Walmart, and then Starbucks, always doing the same thing, either corporate communication or corporate affairs as head of the function. So overall, it's about 25 years. Again, that gave me lots of opportunity to see things firsthand and to learn. Really, on the job learning. I'm glad I'm not just. I think I'm a quick learner. I was able to pick up things, learn quickly, and hopefully been able to live up to the challenges that multinational companies face in this market.
That's an incredible story. And I definitely want to delve into later stages of your career, especially as you've transitioned from different industries. I mean, aerospace to Siemens, which does a lot of different things. And then to, of course, like food and retail with Walmart and Nestle, but also crossing. I know if you zoom out, it's Western cultures, but there are nuances to US business culture versus European. So I'd like to dive into that a little bit. But if I could go back to kind of the beginning there with that first job in PR, I'm really curious. You said that it was about just getting your story out there, telling your story, brand recognition. Was there any kind of culture class that you really saw between the, so you had a Western PR firm and how the Chinese consumer, digested information, or because a lot of these, back at that time, like China was just still opening. So, yeah, I'm just curious, was there mismatches, what learnings you had, how things evolved? I mean, I would imagine that there was an evolution of the Chinese consumer alongside of the evolution of the Western companies as they learned about the Chinese consumer. Could you touch on those dynamics a little bit?
Yeah, I think at the beginning, the first, I would say, 15 to 20 years from 1980, that's pretty much China started to open up and open the door, and then foreign companies started coming in. From then for about, again, 20 years, let's say, it's pretty much China was like a sponge, absorbing anything that people brought in. In PR, in a profession, as I can remember, we knew nothing about PR. Even though we started in the firm, again, I don't even know what account servicing meant. So we were like a dry sponge, absorbing anything, everything. It was like dictation. The job was done at the request, dictated by the clients. Remember, the assignment was very straightforward. We want to get this news out. We want to give us an idea. And of course, you draft a press release, and then you hold a press conference, and then we chase every reporter for a clipping. That was very simple. I think that kind of dynamics lasted for 15, 20 years. We absorbed and try to learn everything without much local input. In a sense, that was not very helpful for expat colleagues. They give them impression that was so easy. You just tell them to do things and they will do it. We can literally deliver. And so that was, again, the other side of the coin thing was kind of not very helpful in that sense. And then the second phase, as I said, after the first 20 years, it was like absorbing. And then people start to learn and to realize there are other ways to do things. And then not everything Western was good. You need to localize. You need to consider local cultural sensitivities. I spent 10 years at Nestlé just by developing a food to the local taste. That's a
Mm.
typical example. When Nestle first came in, it was Nescafé. It
I
was
drank a
just,
lot of Nescafe when I
oh
was in
yeah, it was just
China.
Nescafé. It was instant coffee that you can buy elsewhere in the United States and without much consideration of the local taste. Of course, everything Western was welcome at that time. People didn't care and thought, okay, we'll buy it. They buy it. But then realized that this is not the kind of drink we want to have. This is too bitter.
Mhm.
And then Nestle realized that. They started to deliver a local version. This is what we call the 1+2. They can mix the coffee made, and sugar, make it easier for a
Mhm.
Chinese consumer to make a coffee. So that's the learning curve. At the beginning, it was not the case. And then they learned it and then delivered local product. That took them more than 10 years to do. I think that's why I say, for the first 15, 20 years, I was just absorbing, and then starting the second half, really try to adapt to the local culture and local reality. Chinese consumers, again, especially now, they are very picky. They can choose between brands. They can just jump between brands for a very small feature, a new feature. The brand loyalty, I mean, we don't really have a very strong brand loyalty in this market. People can
Mhm.
just, first of all, there are so many things to choose from. And secondly, people are always after new things. And that requires foreign companies to adapt to this market, to develop, to get the sensitivity, and to develop product that meet their taste. Before this conversation, I'm reading the internet. The Volkswagen China CEO said something. He said, "You know what? We are so slow to develop products for the Chinese market. Our product is being seen as a product belong to the parent generation. We
Mm.
fail to capture the new sensitivity." That's just an article I read a few minutes ago. PR as well, corporate affairs, the same thing. At the beginning, we're just basically telling the story and to get the name out.
Mhm.
And then as we move on, become a lot more sophisticated, and to develop a brand that suits the local culture, that is correct culturally, politically, and that appeals to the consumers. Nestle, let's use Nestle because I spent 10 years over there, and then they had a coffee program. That's the strength of Nestle. They want to control the raw materials, especially the major raw materials that make the products. That primarily milk, coffee, cocoa, and all this. So when they first came to China, they followed the same principle. At that time, China had no coffee plant growth. They have to import all the coffee beans from overseas. For such a big market, you cannot rely on imports for such a major product. So they decided to grow coffee in China. After extensive research, they chose Yunnan and decided to grow coffee in Yunnan. Again, it was tough to start
Beautiful
from zero.
place.
Yeah, they sent people to Yunnan to help local farmers to grow coffee and provided training and even provided trees, coffee trees free. So at first, the farmers didn't know much about coffee. They have no interest. But after a few years, some people who tried got a good business because they could sell the coffee. Nestle would buy all the coffees they produce. So that will save them lots of hassle to sell it. And so the first farmers who grow coffee and able to sell it made some good money. And that, had a good example, a role model. And then other farmers followed their suit. More and more farmers joined. But for a long time, Nestle only had people in Yunnan. They did not even have a warehouse. They rented two apartment buildings in a residential area. They rented a farmhouse, a warehouse for the coffee bean. So I was head of corporate affairs for Nestle. I joined them in 2008. I went down there and said, this is not right. We say we're committed to China. We've done so much groundwork for coffee farming in Yunnan. And that's a major corporate social responsibility endeavor. And they got the recognition even by the highest leader of this country. It was lots of political capital from that efforts. But at the same time, we did not even invest a penny. We don't have any infrastructure to support our effort. So I literally shared that idea with my CEO, my boss. I said, no, if we want really to be careful, to be serious, to be seen as committed to this market, let's make a investment to support our effort. So after a lot of discussion and internal debate, the company agreed to the proposal. And we invest this money to build what we call the coffee farming, the coffee center in Pu'er.
How neat.
For the opening, even the global CEO came to the opening and he was impressed by that. And I think that story shows that as we move on, at first, if you asked me to do that, I wouldn't be able to have that proposal when I first joined, the PR profession.
Sure.
But then when we moved on, I said, you have to make the presence, to show the commitment. That's like a statement on the ground. That's the Nestle commitment to China. So that's, again, moving from the very basics to the sophisticated in the transformation.
Well, and what you did there must have been pretty novel or new, or because later, that was before really my time in China as a professional, at least. Later, when I came back and when we crossed paths doing corporate affairs, that seemed to be something that more and more multinationals were doing, was this idea of making a visible investment, whether it was a research center or a lab, if you were a food company doing food safety or some sort of uh, quality ingredients research. So it sounds like you were a little bit pioneering there with Nestle and Yunnan.
It sounds a bit arrogant, but I think
Yeah, I know I
yeah,
put you on the
I
spot. I'm
was.
sorry, but
Honestly, I think I was.
at least you
I
can
think,
speak to that. That was really something new though when you did it, right?
yeah, for this conversation, I've been thinking about the evolving role of corporate affairs. I've been in this profession for 30 years. I think what has changed and what has not. And I've given a lot of thought about this. At first, it was very basic. And also at that time, corporate affairs or corporate communication or PR, whatever you call, different companies use different names, were just a department that implement things at the direction of the CEO, right? But as time evolves, as more and more multinational companies come into China and they really want to show commitment to this country, the expectations on the role of the corporate affairs has also evolved because corporate affairs can bring in a unique perspective about the cultural correctness and political correctness into the business strategy. Again, just to be honest, Frank, I think I was one of the first persons, early persons to recognize the change of the role in this regard. And that's why I was able to get involved in the company business strategy development, like the proposal to build the Nescafé coffee center in Yunnan, that kind of proposal. Frankly speaking, a lot of my peers had not been able to live up to that challenge, to play that role yet. Even the role itself has evolved, but then the actual people who are doing the work have not been able to live up to that challenge yet. So that's why I have the opportunity to do so, right? The coffee center, there was none, so I was there to help propose that. Nestle had another similar investment, the Dairy Farming Institute. That's another similar
Mm.
training center that helped, on the one hand, help China to develop a modern dairy farm. Secondly, put Nestle in a strong footing in the business. So that earned the company a lot of political capital, to give the company a strong license to operate in this market.
I mean, I think you're being very modest the more I listen. And I think by the time I showed up, I mean, I was in China before this, studying and traveling around and being a student. But really, when I showed up in China, at least working with multinationals back in 2015, what you just described as something that was very new and pioneering, that was almost table stakes. That's what was expected. And if you went and had a government meeting, they wanted some concrete evidence of an investment and an enduring investment, So yeah, I think you're being too modest there. I think you were, if not the pioneer, you were really part of the first wave of corporate affairs professionals to recognize this. And again, by the time that I showed up on the scene, it was kind of expected of multinationals to do this.
Frankly, I think reason you were in China was for the Food Safety Institute. I think that was by itself was a pioneer project. I think that put Walmart in a very strong footing in this market. It was a great investment and very worthy for the company, especially for the size of Walmart. It's something very worthwhile to do. I mean, I think I was there at the opening. I think you had an opening ceremony in Beijing. Dr. McMillan was there. You guys were all there. I think that was a great investment.
Yeah, just being a part of that. And I wish it was as eloquent as we got. I wish the process had been as eloquent, at least as what you described, of going to Yunnan and quickly identifying an issue and seeing the immediate need to invest capital there. Because, of course, the process to get to that food safety center was a big or a fairly lengthy process of discovery, but I think we ended up in a great place. Not to brag on ourselves, but I think we
Yeah.
did some unique things. And I guess the external validation was we had so many companies after we launched that food safety center that came to us and said, okay, who did you work with and how can we, do something similar? I'll let those people give us validation, but I do want to go back eventually to something that you touched on about the Chinese consumer always wanting the new. I think that's very interesting. But if I can put a pin in that and just while we're on this topic. So we've gone from the evolution of corporate affairs in China, so to speak. We've gone from just the early days of Western companies saying we want to get our story out there, it's about brand awareness, to now we've just talked at length about one evolution that you were a key part of, and that's showing visible investment in the country. What do you think, or where are we at right now? Or where do you think we're going? Is there really a third stage of this that we're in right now? Or are we on the cusp of something? Where do you see corporate affairs going, at least from the perspective of multinationals operating in China?
Um,
And if I can make the question even harder for you,
sure.
is, at the same time, you hear all these, at least, especially from the United States, we need to diversify our supply chains. People have given different names over the past 5 or 10 years about how Western companies talk about this. We're going to build in China to service the China market, but then diversify outside of China. So there's been lots of really catchy names again given to different strategies of dealing with the two markets, really China and then outside of China for some of these multinationals. So I think that makes it a little bit harder, right? When you talk about showing visible investment necessarily in the country sometimes. And are you favoring China? This is from the perspective of the US company. Are we favoring this international market, China, more than our own domestic market, or markets closer to our own home market, where maybe we have a little bit more market share, but there's more opportunity in China? At least from my perspective, it's create a little bit more of a tightrope. The path to walk is a little bit narrower for these countries, but would love to get your take and get your sense of where at least the successful or the companies that seem to have an idea of a successful strategy there, what they're doing in this next phase of corporate affairs.
I think, as I said just now, the role of corporate affairs has really evolved from it's just telling the story to really become a core part of the overall business strategy, business plan. I think first and foremost, corporate affairs teams, they need to grow up. They need to live up to that challenge. Many people have not been able to do so yet, especially when it comes to public affairs issues. And you mentioned the geopolitical environment and make it even more complicated. But the public affairs issues by themselves are complicated enough. I always feel that at the UN SDGs, the sustainable development goals, right? At the very highest level, at the UN level, these are great goals. Either eliminate poverty, or diversity or inclusive. That's all great goals, right? But then when it comes to implementation, it requires lots of deep thinking and careful management. For example, just about every multinational company like to say, wherever we operate, we comply with the local laws and regulations. Walmart says that, Nestle said that, and I think every multinational company will make that statement. But local laws and regulations are based on local values,
Mm.
right? So very often it is not surprising that a Chinese law can be in conflict with an American law. There's nothing right and nothing wrong. It's just because of different values. So when you say you follow the local laws and regulations, you have to be very careful. You know what you're saying. When it comes to a real challenge, how you face that.
Mm.
Also, the buzzword now in corporate social responsibility world is ESG, and then environment, society, and governance. Under ESG, people are discussing the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. Again, these are great discussions, great ambitions. But then China, because of the culture, has a very different interpretation of inclusiveness, of diversity.
Interesting.
This is LG.
LGBTQ plus.
I cannot
Yeah.
even.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I have no
It's a lot
problem
of,
with exactly with that. But then what is being done in the U.S. in the Chinese environment, you cannot do it. I think public affairs issues would be a very critical area that tests the capability of corporate affairs professionals, but also the management team. The CEO, if you're a CEO from the United States running your company's business in China, you have to be fully aware of that. And the corporate affairs person should give you the input, give you advice of what is right, what is wrong in this environment. So that's a very typical example that I always like to share with people. Already you have seen many what we call crisis, media crisis in this country. One of the latest one was, what's it? There was an Italian fashion brand, so Dolce Gabbana. It was a very,
I'm not familiar with this story, but
yeah, well,
please.
anyway, it's an Italian fashion brand. The European team produced a TV commercial to promote the brand. But the TV commercial features a Oriental girl eating
Mhm.
pizza
Yeah, I think I heard this
using,
one. Yeah. But
yeah,
please.
using for the European team who make this TV commercial. So that was just sense of humor. But then the consumers in China, when this was aired in China, they got so upset. They felt that it's kind of like an insult, making fun of the Chinese people.
Mm.
At first, Dolce Gabbana didn't take that seriously. They even argued back. They said, hey, you guys misunderstood. There was lots of argument over the internet. But then there was a real boycott of the brand. And they realized, this is really hurting the business. So much that they had to pull off a planned fashion show for the brand. That's a typical example. I use that very, very often with other people, as if corporate affairs have been asked to vet, to review the TVC before it is aired. They can probably give it the right input because corporate affairs people should be able to do that. So my argument for that is make corporate affairs team as part of the vetting process for all the
Mm.
materials, including marketing product materials that go into the public, just to make sure that crisis like Dolce Gabbana doesn't happen. Because that crisis cost them a lot of money. I think they're still in China, probably, but their business ran into a huge setback because of that crisis. And there are other crises like that in China, just because of the cultural insensitivity or political insensitivity that landed them in a big problem. And just back to the question, I think corporate affairs should play that role going forward.
That's
So again, just to
really good.
recap, to play the real
Please.
role of the corporate strategy. You proposing rather than just sit there and being dictated to do things. Secondly, a key sensitive area is public affairs topics. Make sure that every topic, actually behind every public affairs topic, there will be a controversy between the Chinese culture and the Western culture. Again, there's nothing right, nothing wrong. It's just different culture. This is not just a China issue. I'm sure India would have the same issue for American companies. Indonesia would have the same issue for American companies. It's just so different. Japan is an exception. People might think that Japan is Asia and then Japan is so easy. But Japan is totally westernized. Japan is no longer a kind of Asian culture in a sense. Again, deep down, they are still a culture, Asian culture, but they are very, very much westernized. Korea also very much westernized, but China is not yet. Vietnam, no. India, no. So this is the thing that's not just
Huh.
China, elsewhere in Asia as well.
See, that's interesting. And we don't need to, we probably don't have time on this interview to get into too much of a lengthy discussion. That's interesting because my initial reaction would be to take the opposite of that in some ways. At least in my experience in China, I actually felt like the Chinese, now there's some, I think largely due to the political structures in China and the modern history. I think there's some differences that we really rub up against, but there's so many things about modern Chinese culture, the consumer, that I think I would actually place them closer to the US consumer than I would the Japanese, or I think Korea. I really don't know where to slot it. Of course, out of the three, I've probably spent the least amount of time in Korea, but that's interesting because I feel like, yeah, Japan, obviously, like there's less geopolitical tension there, but I feel like culturally, Japan is still a very traditional place with a lot of very traditional values. Whereas I feel like China, maybe this is the way that I get back. And sorry, making you zigzag a little bit, going back to this idea that Chinese consumer always wanting something new. I mean, when I was in China, my experience in China is it's a consumer that really seeks novelty, very much about the new. There's a new restaurant that opens, you see a line, across the block, people waiting 3 hours for a new donut or a new tea or something like that. And I think people who haven't experienced China, who maybe if I could create a fictitious European who goes to the United States, they would think that we're a huge consumer culture, always wanting the new. But what I tell people is you see that in the United States, you go to China and I feel like it's even to a greater extent. So I guess, two questions. If I can tie these together with two questions, what's your reaction to my like that actually the US and the Chinese consumer, if you put aside some geopolitical sensitivities that I think create some of these frictions, they're actually closer than maybe the US consumer is or the Western consumer is to say Japan or some other markets. And then two, my second question that would be, why is the Chinese consumer so, I've heard some people give different theories, but I'd love to hear yours. Why is the Chinese consumer so open to new products, new ways of doing things? And I'm going to drag you into a conversation a little bit about AI later. But from what I understand, like you have grandmas in China being encouraged to use like new AI operating systems like OpenClaw and things where here in the United States, I mean, that might be very aspirational trying to get a grandma to use OpenClaw. But, here in the United States, it's, pretty big if somebody of an older generation is getting onto ChatGPT and just simply asking it a question. So I think the Chinese consumer and it's really accepting of new products and new things. So why is that? And I love to hear your pushback on mine that actually the US and the Chinese consumer are actually closer than they are further apart. If you take away some of these geopolitical factors that create frictions.
And that's a very interesting question. That's a good question. Why Chinese consumers always like doing new things? I like to think about that things. My understanding is this is again culture. This is deep down in our psyche. We are a very crowded country, 1.4 billion people. Especially under the old system, everyone looks the same. Using the latest example is the Mao jacket. It's either blue or gray. It's not no other colors. We were so because everyone looks the same. But now we have the opportunity. People have a very strong desire to be different. I'm not one of the pack. I'm different from the pack. So that's why people are always chasing for new things. I just came back from a few days in Shanxi province. Even the pagoda, if you listen to the local narrative, they will say, yeah, they have such pagodas in China, but ours is unique because of the top, it looks different. They always find something to tell you we are different. No, that's how I see it. Because we're so crowded, people have a desire to try to be different. That's why. And then on the Western part, because I do see this competition, and then that makes some of the multinationals feel a bit of depressed now because they couldn't keep up with the competition, with local competition in some areas. I think it's a mindset thing. Especially when I was in Nestlé, I could feel that very strongly. The way I see it was like a Western mindset. If I develop something successful, I'll let it run. I'll just lay back and then enjoy to get the most out of it. So much so, people are even talking about the residual value from a successful business model or successful product, right? That's, I feel, is like a Western mindset. But in China, because of what I said, people are always go after new things. If I don't have a new product in 3 years, my company is pretty much dead. If consumers would expect me to deliver new things, Apple did a good job because every year they have a new model. If Apple doesn't have a new model that quickly, they'll be falling behind. So I think that's a major difference. But again, I think I always feel, again, we are very, Chinese people in a sense are resourceful. I wouldn't say we are creative, we are resourceful. We always come up with a solution. You give me a problem, I'll try to give you a solution. We're resourceful in that sense. And that, I think, is a strength of the Chinese people. That's why now you see the EVs, the drones, and many, many Chinese products, which are taking unicorn companies are very successful. Just take the drone, DJI, the drone that is monopolizing the whole market. If a Chinese company can do so, why not American company? You have the capital, you have the technology, but why not, not the American company who developed the drones? If you have done that, it could easily have done that. Right? It's again, I think just the desire to be different is stronger for our people than elsewhere.
Oh, I want to go down this a little bit more. It's so tempting to go into like the consumer psychology, but if I could pull it back to corporate affairs a little bit more and to touch on something that you said earlier, you were talking about, and this does relate to the conversation because we're in a sense talking about values. And you mentioned you have those UN sort of those Could we consider those universal values, sort of the UN Charter? But then, of course, United States, China, other countries have their own set of values. And I would say that I think, as you alluded to, and I would agree, that when the tension sometimes is the gap, I think, especially between some of the values between the two countries, not necessarily the psychology of the people, and some of their consumer behaviors, but really those values. So my question to this is a lead up to question, very almost a tactical question. So when you have this divergent values and you're a multinational company, what do you do? I've seen companies try the strategy of, well, we'll just have everything that's meant for the Chinese market. We'll just keep that in Mandarin. And so they try this bifurcation by language. If somebody wants to go looking, right, it's not going to be as easily accessible. So what do you do there when language isn't a convenient barrier to keep markets separated and keep markets unaware of what you're doing in each respective ones? How does a multinational balance that?
There's a huge lack of understanding of China. I think that's for sure. I think China, I always like to say that if a foreigner wants to know about China, I recommend 3 books. The first one is The Good Earth by Pearl Buck. This is almost 100 years ago. That book can explain to you, what the Chinese person is like. The second book is Red Star Over China by Edgar Snow. This is an American journalist who went to Yunnan to meet with the communist with Mao and his comrades. That was in the 1940s. And he wrote us a book to explain what communists represent. Who are these people? That will help the reader to understand the party. And the third one is by Henry Kissinger on China. He is able to put China against a bigger historical background, the typical Henry Kissinger, to explain the evolving China from the ancient Chinese, why China is China today, why, it feels insecure, why they feel different. So these are the 3 books. But unfortunately, a lot of Westerners, their understanding of China stuffs with Pearl Buck's The Good Earth. I blame China itself. They're not telling a good story about the country itself. That's the foundation. So for a foreign company, American company coming into China, the boss, yes, language is a big barrier, but then you can travel. I always believe in immersion. Don't just stay in Beijing in your office and talk to your extract colleagues or your immediate staff only. Over the weekend, go to the free market to do shopping, to buy things for yourself. That gives you a lot of exposure, necessary exposure to know not just consumers, the society, what's behind the consumer behavior. I think for many American CEOs, let me put bluntly, they have not done enough in that regard. I'm sure that the Chinese counterparts, a Chinese CEO will do things a bit differently. I think, as I said, I'm a curious person. I think many Chinese people are also curious. They go to the US, they go to West, they try to see as much as they could. I think that kind of immersion is very helpful in helping to understand the culture. That's, I think, in a very short way to answer your question.
I always want to ask this question a little bit later on, but you gave me an opportunity to ask it now. What do China hands get wrong? And I'll just, for the audience's sake, I'll give my explanation of a China hand, Zhongguotong, China hand. These are individuals who've been around China. They lived in China. They travel around China, they're fairly well read. The stereotypical profile when I was in China of a China hand, at least one that was hanging around, Beijing, Shanghai, they lived there for a while. They maybe went to school there. Oftentimes they had a spouse that was Chinese. That seemed to be a very big qualification for being a China hand, was having a spouse. But what do you see, or what have you seen that the China hands get it wrong? Because I always felt like there was this kind of jousting that went back and forth with the China hand, like, oh, I know China more than, and it was typically a room of Westerners all arguing that they knew, or they were all trying to jockey or, portray that they really understood China at the deepest level. But what I always thought was, what is there something that we all don't get, that we've, like, maybe these China hands, and call me an aspiring person to know more about China, not necessarily a China hand. Is there something that we just have a blind spot of, that everyone around us, all the, locals around us just go, hey, they really don't get this? Is there something that you consistently saw that China hands, even the China hands, just don't get about China?
I think the China hands, they are right. They're not wrong. They are right in the first place. But then they're right academically. They are like the economists, the economists across the world. They make all kinds of predictions. They all sound right academically, but then in reality, they are proven wrong. The China has the same problem. In America, the Chinese American hand is the same. They're not so much in touch with reality as often as should. Yet you travel from Beijing to Shanghai by airplane. You go there and meet the local officials or the local academics, and then that's give you enough knowledge to write a paper. Again, you can make a good presentation to your audience, and that it sounds perfect right. But then it just kind of right only at the academic level. This is not a China hand issue. Let me give you another example. Carrefour, unfortunately, it was our competitor. When we worked for Walmart, Carrefour was a major multinational competitor, right? Carrefour was even bigger than Walmart in China for a long time. But unfortunately, because of the local competition, they chose to quit the market. It was very sad. But if you look at the Carrefour management, every one of them, just about every one of them, had an MBA degree. I always say, if you don't have an MBA degree, you probably cannot even be in a leadership role in the business in a company. But then they lost in this market. The winner in the retail business in China is called Pangdonglai. It's getting all of a sudden out of Henan province in the middle of nowhere. Henan Xinjiang. I don't know if you heard of it. It's a very small
Yeah.
place. All of a sudden, there was a retailer become so successful. It has now become the model for every retailer to learn from. Even Walmart is learning from them. But the founder of that retailer did not even finish his high school. That's a typical example, I always say. Look at Carrefour. I'm sorry, I'm using Carrefour.
It's fine.
Every leader
We
has an
probably won't
MBA
have any
degree.
French speakers or
Yeah, right. Exactly.
French nationals looking at this anyways.
But the MBA is failed. The winner is a person who's not even finished his high school. So that's a typical example that explains the things. China has the same issue. They have every argument along the academic lines, but then a lot of them are boardroom discussions, unfortunately. You have Gordon Chang. He is a commentator in a lot of networks in the US. The guy, I guess 20 years ago, wrote a book. He is a Chinese American. He was a lawyer. He was stationed in Shanghai for a long time. He speaks Chinese. He wrote a book, China Collapse, the coming collapse of China, or something like that. But then 20 years later, the country is not collapsing. Oh, and his book was a bestseller. Oh, yeah,
I know.
he is making a big prediction. See, that's why academics China has, they make that kind of prediction. Unfortunately, it's out of touch with reality. I'm very blunt with that. You have to live with my language.
Oh, no, you're being measured. I know we're getting up on an hour here, so there's so much more that I wanted to get to that maybe we can save for a next conversation. I think we could have, 2 more hours. But just to pick up on what you were talking about, and hopefully I'm pronouncing the retailer and Henan.
Yes, Pangdonglai. Yeah.
What do you think that they're getting right about the Chinese consumer that the other retailers aren't? And why aren't the other retailers getting it right? Because I think about, our most immediate example, our shared example here, and I'm not to call them out, but if you look at a Walmart, I think right now they have a mixture of local talent and expats. And I would imagine, and of course you have some local brands, of course, like Alibaba and its affiliates and others who are operating in China. So what's so special about Pangdonglai? Are they getting something about Chinese culture that maybe some of the multinationals aren't getting? And if the multinationals aren't getting it, is it because what Pangdonglai is doing is just that much more innovative? Or is there something about just the structure of straddling two worlds, maybe, even if you have a blended workforce where you just can't pick up on all the signals? I'm curious if there's something about multinationals. I guess what I'm trying to pick at is there something about multinationals and even how they're structured, even if you have locals, that keeps them from being as nimble? I mean, if Pangdonglai can help us surface some of those things, or is Pangdonglai they're just innovators, even by local standards?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I think many who are studying Pangdonglai, why they are so successful. It's phenomenal. The way I see it, there are, I would say, two things probably. I can give you five or 10 things, but two are most important. The first one, they try to create a sense of community within their store, that people like to hang around in their store. Really, this is my center of my community. In the Chinese society, you know what that means, right? We are a community kind of people. Community is always bigger than me, the individual. So we want to hang around, get together. So that atmosphere. You go there, they give you great service. The washroom is so clean. They even have, lockers. If you carry so much things, free lockers, so clean, so clean, so spacious, make it so convenient for you. That's number one. Number two, if you look at the traditional, let me use that word, traditional retailers, either it was Carrefour or with Walmart, I'm going to use that name, or whoever, the commodities looks pretty much the same. You see the same Nescafé everywhere. The only difference is pricing. Really, not much differentiation between retailers except the name. Pangdonglai chose a different path. They developed lots of self-brands and also very high quality standard. That quickly won the trust of consumers. I remember I said, consumers like to buy unique things. Pangdonglai, because there's so many self-brands, you can choose whatever. It's all very unique that you don't see elsewhere in the market. I think many retailers now are copying the model. You go to a local retailer now, 50, even 60% of products are self-brand now. So that's high quality products and also self-brands. And of course, the first one is sense of community. And these are the two that make Pangdonglai very successful, very unique, really standing out from the pack. From our Food Safety Institute, I'm sure you would go visit them and talk to them about their practices.
I was going to say on my next trip to China, I think we need to go visit Henan, go to Pangdonglai, go to
I
talk,
always
see what the
wanted to
secret
go
sauce.
to, yeah, yeah.
We have to do it. I think I'll add this to our itinerary. As you're talking and as we talked before we started the interview, I'm already creating an itinerary for us to go together.
Sure. It's very worthwhile to go there.
Hey, Jonathan, before we close, I want to give you an opportunity, and I think it's really relevant to the conversation we've had here this morning, or at least this morning, US, China evening. You've had a book project that you're working on, really highlighting some of the cultural exchange between China and the West. And so, would you mind closing with just a few minutes about the project that you've been working on?
Yeah, this is not published yet. It's with the publisher, and the publisher likes it. The idea came not just from me, but from me and Beth Keck, our co-colleague from Walmart. She was teaching at Tsinghua, and then we had coffee and we talked, and then the idea came up. It was really China is going to celebrate 50th anniversary of its opening reform in 2 years, at the end of 2028. That's 50 years. Time really goes very quickly, and I think that's a moment we both felt that we should reflect on what has happened and what have learned, the good things and the failures, so that for the next 50 years, the country can continue to move on, continue to be a driver of the global economy or whatever force for good in the world. So we thought, okay, we all have the experience. It's personal experience from our standpoint, but putting them all together, hopefully they can piece together the transformation through these small things. So we talked to a few people. We have about now 11 people who are willing, very happy about the idea, are willing to contribute stories about their personal experiences. Americans working, living in China, and people like me working, I studied in Canada and working in the US, and our personal experiences. So when we sent the manuscript to the publisher, they were all in English, and we thought we want to do an English version. And they liked it. They said, okay, why don't we also do a Chinese version? So they want to do a Chinese version as well as an English version. According to plan, the Chinese version will be out this October, and then early next year will be the English version. They want to hold it back a little bit to coincide with the 50th anniversary celebration. They thought that will provide a very good backdrop for the book. The book is tentatively titled Crossing the Ocean.
I like that.
Crossing the Ocean.
That's the English title. What's the Chinese title?
Yeah, that's the English.
What is the Chinese title for our bilingual audience?
The Chinese title would be 跨越大洋, literal translation. We started to have the English first, and the Chinese is actually a back translation. So Crossing the Ocean in English, or 跨越大洋 in Chinese.
I know it's been a labor of love for you, and I'm so happy to see it come together and knowing both you and Beth, two people who I know have been very much invested in China opening up and the cultural exchange between the two countries. So I couldn't think of two better people to be involved with such a project.
Yeah, I mean, Beth and I were talking about do a volume two. Anyone who really want to share their personal experiences from the past 40, 50 years between the two sides of the ocean, you're always welcome to join us. The book is published by China Foreign Languages Press, a credible publisher.
Probably don't have as incredible stories as you do. And I know we didn't have time to get into some of your early stories, some of your culture shocks about being in Canada, which I've heard before, and they were awesome. But I would be happy to submit some humble stories from my going back and forth. And just you talking about her makes me reflect on somebody much younger than myself that's studying right now in China. Actually took your early young professional, took a sabbatical year off from a company to go and learn Mandarin in Beijing. And, I've been going back and forth with him a little bit. So it is neat to hear the stories from you and others, and then, have my own shared experience. And now with this other individual to see this kind of evolution of people I think it really comes from a point of curiosity on both sides, but how that curiosity can lead us to far off places. I won't be too nostalgic here as we end here, but I will end it with a thank you and an invitation or a hope that you'll join me again. Cause, as I look here at the questions I prepared, I think we only got to about half of them, but I think our conversation went in some really interesting directions. So not to put you here on the spot, but hey, what about a round two soon?
Sure, I'll be more than happy to do so. Let me know
Well,
what time works
Jonathan,
for you.
again,
I'll do it again.
great. Jonathan, again, thank you so much. I always enjoy our conversations. Like I said at the top of it, there's very few people that I know who understand both countries and both cultures as well as you do. So thank you again for, our friendship and for continuing our dialogues on all these topics and for getting on camera with me here today. This was special. Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a good day, Will.
Thanks, Jonathan.